The grand concert hall in Vienna smelled like old wood, polished brass, and the faintest trace of perfume from the well-dressed crowd. It was the kind of place where silence felt heavy, like it had weight, and every cough or rustle of a program seemed too loud. In the front row, a 17-year-old girl sat perfectly still, her hands folded gently in her lap. She wore a simple navy dress, her dark hair pulled back neatly. A white cane rested against the leg of her chair, its tip barely touching the plush red carpet. She couldn't see the gilded ceiling, the crystal chandeliers, or the sea of elegant faces around her, but she didn't need to. She was here for the music. Her name was Alara, and from the moment she was born, the world had been dark. But that darkness had never been empty. It had always been filled with sound. Her mother humming lullabies, rain tapping on the roof of their small house in southern Spain, birds singing at dawn, and most of all, the piano. Her grandmother, who had passed away when Alara was just 10, used to say that music wasn't something you saw. It was something you felt in your bones, in your chest, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. She'd taught Alara to listen not just to the notes, but to the breath between them, the tension before a chord resolved, the way a melody could rise like a prayer or fall like a sigh. Alara had spent years at her old upright piano, fingers learning the shape of every key, every scale, every piece by memory. She didn't read sheet music, she couldn't, but she didn't need to. She absorbed music the way others absorbed sunlight. She could hear a recording once and play it back with astonishing accuracy, but more than that, she could feel it. She'd add little pauses, soften certain notes, stretch others, tiny choices that made the music breathe in a way that surprised even her teachers. Tonight was special. The world-famous pianist Julian Voss was giving a rare public masterclass. He was known not just for his flawless technique, but for his sharp tongue and unshakable confidence. People said he could dissect a Chopin nocturne like a surgeon, revealing every hidden intention. Alara had listened to his recordings for years. She admired his precision, even if his playing sometimes felt cold. Still, to hear him live, to be in the same room as his music, that was a dream. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "You're doing great, Mija," she whispered, her voice warm with pride and a touch of nerves. "Just breathe." Alara nodded, her heart pounding not from fear but from excitement. She'd never been to a concert hall this grand. Back home, the biggest audience she'd played for was her village's annual festival, where people clapped politely and kids ran around eating churros. This was different. This was the heart of classical music. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Then Julian Voss walked onto the stage. He was tall, dressed in a crisp black suit, his silver hair combed back neatly. He gave a small, confident bow, sat at the gleaming Steinway, and began to play. It was Liszt's Liebesträume, a piece about dreams of love. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and control. The sound was powerful, precise, dazzling. The audience sat mesmerized, but Alara listened deeper. She heard the perfection, yes, but also something missing. There was no hesitation, no vulnerability. It was like watching a perfect sculpture, beautiful but unmoving. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People stood clapping, whistling. Voss smiled, clearly pleased. Then came the masterclass portion. A few young pianists were invited on stage to play a short piece and receive feedback from Voss. Alara watched, or rather, listened, as each one played. She could tell who was nervous, who was trying too hard, who truly loved the music beneath the notes. After the last student finished and returned to their seat, Voss turned to the audience. "Before we conclude," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, "I'll take 1 or 2 questions. Keep them brief." A murmur went through the crowd. Hands shot up. Alara hesitated. Her mother squeezed her hand again. "Go on," she whispered. "Ask it." Alara took a deep breath, stood slowly, and raised her hand. She didn't know if he'd see her, but someone near her must have pointed because Voss's gaze landed on her. "Yes," he said, his tone polite but distant. Alara's voice was soft at first, but clear. "I was wondering, in Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, especially the first movement, how do you interpret the silences between the notes, the spaces where nothing is played?" It was a thoughtful question. The Moonlight Sonata is famous for its haunting, slow triplets and the way it seems to float in a dreamlike haze. The rests, the silences, are as important as the notes themselves. They create tension, longing, mystery. For a moment, Voss was quiet. Then he chuckled. Not a kind chuckle, but one that carried a hint of condescension. He turned slightly toward the audience as if sharing a private joke. "Well," he said, his voice now carrying easily through the hall, "that's an interesting question. But let's be honest. How can someone who's never seen moonlight, who's never seen the play of light and shadow on water, truly understand the emotional depth of those silences? Music isn't just sound. It's vision. It's color. It's the world reflected through art." The room went still for a split second. Then a few people laughed, nervous at first, then louder as if given permission. Someone snorted. Another muttered, "He's got a point." Ilara felt the words like a physical blow. Her cheeks burned. Her hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble. She stood frozen, not knowing whether to sit down or say something else. Her mother's grip on her arm tightened protectively. Voss didn't look at her again. He turned back to the piano as if the matter were closed. "Next question?" But there were no more questions. The mood had shifted. The magic of the evening had cracked. Her mother gently guided her back to her seat. Ilara kept her head down, blinking hard to hold back tears. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to scream. But more than anything, she wanted to prove him wrong, not with words, but with music. As they walked out of the hall, the applause for Voss's final encore echoing behind them, Ilara said nothing. She held her cane tightly, her jaw set. The cool night air hit her face sharp and clean after the stuffy warmth of the concert hall. Carriages clattered by on the cobblestone street. People chatted in languages she didn't understand. Back at their small hotel room, her mother tried to comfort her. "He's just arrogant, Mija. Don't let his words stick to you." But Ilara wasn't crying anymore. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the darkness she'd always known. "He thinks because I can't see, I can't feel," she said quietly. "He thinks silence is empty for me." Her mother sat beside her. "And is it?" Ilara shook her head. "No, my silence is full. It's where the music lives." She remembered her grandmother's voice, rough with age but warm as bread fresh from the oven. "Child, the blind don't live in silence. We live in sound. Every footstep, every breath, every note, it paints a picture in our minds brighter than any painting." That night, Ilara didn't sleep. She lay awake replaying Voss's words, not with shame, but with a growing fire. She thought about the Moonlight Sonata, not as a piece about moonlight, but as a piece about longing. About being alone in the dark, waiting for something you can't see but deeply feel. She thought about the silences, not as empty gaps, but as spaces where the heart speaks loudest. By morning, her humiliation had hardened into resolve. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to shame him. She wanted to show him, and everyone who'd laughed, that music doesn't live in the eyes. It lives in the soul. On the train back to Spain, she sat by the window, her fingers tapping silently on her knee, composing in her mind. She imagined a piece that would begin in stillness, then rise like a storm, then return to calm, but a calm that had been changed by the storm. A piece that would make people feel what she felt, the beauty of darkness, the power of listening, the truth that some of the deepest emotions are wordless, sightless, and yet utterly real. Her mother watched her, seeing the quiet determination in her daughter's face. She didn't say much. She just reached over and squeezed Ilara's hand. When they arrived home, Ilara went straight to the piano. She lifted the fallboard, ran her fingers over the familiar keys, ivory worn smooth by years of practice, and took a deep breath. Then without hesitation, she began to play. It wasn't Beethoven. It wasn't Chopin. It was something new, something raw, something true. And in that small room, with sunlight streaming through the window she couldn't see, the music began to heal what words had broken and plant the seed of something extraordinary. For days after they returned home, the house was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet Ilara was used to, but a heavy, thick silence that clung to the walls like dust. She barely spoke. She didn't touch the piano. She sat by the window in the small living room, her fingers tracing the edge of the windowsill, listening to the wind rustle through the olive trees outside. The mocking laughter from the concert hall kept replaying in her mind, sharp and sudden like a needle skipping on an old record. And worse than the laughter was the voice, calm, certain, dismissive, saying she couldn't understand music because she'd never seen light. Her mother didn't push her. She knew better. Instead, she made warm meals, left cups of chamomile tea on the table beside her, and went about her chores with gentle footsteps, giving Alara space to heal in her own time. But she watched. She saw the way her daughter's shoulders tensed when a piano piece came on the radio. She saw how Alara flinched, just slightly, when someone mentioned Vienna. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a basket of fresh figs. "How's the girl?" she asked softly, nodding toward the window where Alara sat. "She's hurting," her mother said simply, "but she'll find her way back." And then, on the fifth morning, something changed. Alara woke before sunrise, as she often did. The house was still dark, the air cool and sweet with the scent of jasmine from the garden. She got up, washed her face, and walked slowly to the piano in the corner of the living room. She didn't sit right away. She just stood there, her hand resting on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips. It was the same piano her grandmother had played, the same one she'd learned on as a child. The keys were slightly yellowed, one of the pedals squeaked, and the high C was a little flat, but to Alara it was perfect. It held memories. It held love. She sat down, took a deep breath, and pressed a single key. The note hung in the air, soft, clear, alive. Then another. And another. At first it was just scales, simple exercises, her fingers relearning their home. But soon, without planning, without thinking, she began to play something new. It started low and slow, like footsteps in the dark. Then a rhythm emerged. Not from sheet music, not from a famous composer, but from somewhere deep inside her. It carried the ache of being laughed at, the loneliness of sitting in a room full of people who saw her as less, but also the stubborn warmth of her mother's hand, the echo of her grandmother's voice, the quiet strength of the hills around their village. She played for hours that day. She forgot to eat. Her fingers grew sore, but she didn't stop. When her mother came in to check on her, she stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes, and didn't say a word. She just listened. From that day on, Alara played every morning before the sun rose and every evening after the dishes were done. She stopped trying to copy the great masters exactly. Instead, she began to blend what she loved, the flowing melodies of Chopin, the dramatic storms of Rachmaninoff, with something else. The raw, soulful cry of the old songs her grandmother used to sing. Songs about lost love, hard work, joy in small things. Songs that didn't need fancy concert halls. They were sung in kitchens, in fields, at weddings and funerals, with hand claps and stomping feet and voices that cracked with feeling. She started experimenting. One day, she tapped the side of the piano with her palm like a flamenco dancer might clap. The sound surprised her, dry, sharp, full of rhythm. She tried it again, weaving it between chords. It felt right. Another time, she let her left hand hold a deep, rumbling note, while her right hand danced above it like fireflies in the dusk. She played with silence again, not as empty space, but as breath, as waiting, as reverence. She didn't know it yet, but she was creating something no one had heard before. A language of sound that spoke of both classical discipline and folk art, of blindness and vision, of shame turned into strength. Her only teacher now was an old man named Don Rafael, who lived 3 villages over. He'd once taught at a music conservatory in Madrid, but had retired years ago after his wife passed. He was gruff, with a voice like gravel and hands covered in age spots, but he had ears like a hawk. When Alara's mother asked if he'd listen to her daughter play, he grumbled, "I don't teach children anymore." But he came anyway. The first time he heard her, he stood by the door, arms crossed, face unreadable. She played a piece she'd been working on, a stormy, emotional thing full of sudden stops and surges. When she finished, there was a long pause, then he said, "You're not playing for the judges. You're playing for the truth." Alara didn't know what to say. "I just play what I feel." He nodded slowly. "Good, never lose that." After that, he came once a week. He didn't give her exercises or correct her posture. Instead, he asked questions. "Why did you hold that note longer? What were you thinking when you skipped that beat? Where does this part come from, your head or your chest?" He pushed her to go deeper, to trust her instincts, to stop worrying about what should be played and focus on what needed to be played. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled in the distance, Alara played a new piece for him. It began with a single, trembling note like a heartbeat in the dark. Then it built, layer by layer, into something vast and aching, full of longing and resilience. In the middle, she wove in a familiar melody, the opening of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. But she didn't play it straight. She slowed it down, softened it, let the silences breathe like open wounds. Then, just as the mood threatened to drown in sadness, she introduced a new rhythm, fast, fiery, defiant, inspired by the footwork of flamenco dancers. It was as if the darkness wasn't something to fear, but something to move through, to dance in. When she finished, Don Rafael was silent for a long time. Rain tapped against the roof. Finally, he cleared his throat. "That," he said, his voice rough, "is not just music. That's a story. And the world needs to hear it." Ilara shook her head. "No one will listen to a blind girl from a village no one's heard of." "Maybe not," he said. "But what if they don't know who you are at first?" He had an idea. Without telling her, he recorded her playing that piece on his old digital recorder, the kind with slightly fuzzy sound but good enough. He called the piece Luz, Spanish for light. He thought it was fitting, music made in darkness that carried its own kind of illumination. Then, one evening, while Ilara was helping her mother fold laundry, Don Rafael slipped away to the post office. He printed a simple sheet of paper with only the title Luz and the name of the piece, Sonata of the Unseen Sun. No name, no photo, no explanation. Just the recording on a USB drive and a short note. "This was played by someone who hears the world differently. Please listen with your heart, not your eyes." He sent it to the Geneva International Piano Competition, one of the most respected contests in the world. He knew the odds were tiny. Hundreds, maybe thousands of entries came in every year from prodigies at elite conservatories, from students with famous teachers and perfect resumes. But he also knew that true art sometimes slips through the cracks and lands exactly where it's meant to. Weeks passed. Life went on. Ilara kept playing, kept refining her piece, kept tending to the garden with her mother, kept listening to the night sounds, the crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the wind in the trees. She didn't think about Vienna anymore, or at least she tried not to. The wound was still there, but it was healing, covered now with calluses of purpose. Then one afternoon the phone rang. Her mother answered. Ilara heard her gasp. "Are you sure?" Her mother said, her voice trembling. "But there must be some mistake." She hung up and stood in the hallway for a full minute, just breathing. Then she walked into the living room where Ilara was practicing. "Mija," she said softly. Ilara stopped playing. "What is it?" "The Geneva competition," they called. "They want you to come. They want you to play Luz, live. In the finals," Ilara froze. "But I didn't enter." "I know," her mother said, tears in her eyes. "Don Rafael did." Ilara's heart pounded. Geneva, one of the biggest stages in the classical world. Judges from all over, cameras, critics, and among them she'd heard the rumors would be Julian Voss serving as a guest juror. Fear rose in her throat like bile. The memory of his voice, the laughter, the shame, it all came rushing back. She wanted to say no, to hide, to stay in this safe, quiet house where no one judged her by what she couldn't see. But then she thought of her grandmother's hands on the old guitar, calloused and strong. She thought of Don Rafael's quiet belief. She thought of all the hours she'd spent turning pain into music, and she remembered what her mother always said. "You don't have to be seen to be heard." She took a deep breath. "Okay," she said. "I'll go." Her mother hugged her tightly. "You're not that girl in Vienna anymore," she whispered. "You're the one who made light out of silence." In the days that followed, they scrambled to prepare. Money was tight, but neighbors chipped in. A local business owner donated train fare. Don Rafael helped her rehearse, pushing her to play not just with skill, but with absolute honesty. "Don't try to impress them," he warned. "Try to move them." The night before she left, Ilara sat alone at the piano one last time. She played Sonata of the Unseen Sun from start to finish, not as a performance, but as a prayer. She poured everything into it, her hurt, her hope, her love for the music that had never abandoned her, even when people did. When she finished, the house was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of promise. She stood, touched the piano one last time, and whispered, "Thank you." Then she went to pack her bag, her white cane resting beside it, ready to walk into a room full of strangers and show them what true music sounds like. The train ride to Geneva felt endless. Outside the window, the world blurred past in greens and grays, rolling hills, small towns, rivers glinting under the sun. But Ilara didn't see any of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her white cane tucked between her feet, listening to the rhythmic clack of the wheels on the tracks. It matched the beat of her heart, steady but quickening every time she thought about what waited for her at the end of the line. Her mother sat beside her, quiet but present, her warmth a steady anchor. They hadn't spoken much since leaving home. There was too much to feel, too much to hold inside. Ilara kept running the notes of her piece through her mind. Not just the sounds, but the spaces between them, the breaths, the silences that carried as much weight as the chords. She'd practiced until her fingers knew the path by memory, until the music lived in her bones like a second heartbeat. But knowing it at home in the safety of her own room was one thing. Playing it on a grand stage under bright lights, with strangers watching and judging, that was something else entirely. When they arrived in Geneva, the air felt different, cooler, crisper, charged with a kind of energy she couldn't name. The city hummed with purpose. People walked quickly, speaking languages she didn't understand, their shoes clicking on the cobblestones. Her mother guided her gently through the crowds, describing the tall buildings, the flower stalls, the lake shimmering in the distance. But Ilara's mind was already in the concert hall. The competition organizers had arranged a small hotel near the venue. A young woman named Clara met them at the entrance, warm, efficient, and kind. She introduced herself as the assistant coordinator, and immediately put Ilara at ease with her calm voice and unhurried steps. "We've been waiting for you," Clara said, taking Ilara's bag. "The other finalists arrived yesterday. Rehearsals start tomorrow morning." "Other finalists?" Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are 5 of you," Clara explained, "all incredibly talented. But your recording, it moved everyone." The jury couldn't stop talking about it. Ilara didn't know what to say. She just nodded, her stomach twisting. 5 others, 5 pianists who'd trained at famous schools, who'd performed in grand halls since they were children, who probably didn't have to explain why they carried a white cane. That night, she barely slept. She lay in the narrow hotel bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, a siren far away, the soft murmur of voices from the street below. She thought about the stage, the piano, the judges, and him. She'd heard the rumors before leaving home. Julian Voss would be on the jury. Not just attending, he'd be sitting front and center, listening, evaluating, deciding. The same man who'd laughed at her in Vienna. The same man who'd said she couldn't understand music because she'd never seen light. Part of her wanted to turn back, to get on the next train and disappear into the quiet hills of home. But another part, the part that had stayed up night after night turning pain into melody, knew this was why she'd come. Not for fame, not for revenge, but to prove once and for all that music doesn't live in the eyes. It lives in the soul. The next morning, Clara led her to the concert hall for rehearsal. The building was massive, all stone and glass with wide steps leading up to tall wooden doors. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and anticipation. Footsteps echoed in the high-ceilinged lobby. Somewhere a piano was being tuned, sharp. Metallic pings followed by deep, resonant hums. Clara guided her through the backstage area, describing everything as they went. The green room with its plush chairs, the dressing rooms with their mirrors and bright lights, the narrow hallway that led to the stage wings. Then finally they reached the piano. "It's a Steinway D," Clara said softly, brand new. They brought it in just for the finals. Ilara ran her fingers over the smooth black surface, then lifted the fallboard. The keys felt cool, perfectly even. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands above the keys. For a moment she just breathed. Then she played the opening note of her piece. It rang out, clear, pure, alive. The sound filled the empty hall, bouncing off the walls, wrapping around the empty seats like a voice calling into the dark. She played the first few bars, testing the instrument, feeling its voice. It was responsive, rich, full of depth. It would carry her music well. As she played, she didn't notice the small group that had gathered in the back of the hall. Other finalists, curious staff, a few early arriving technicians. They stood in silence, watching this quiet girl with the white cane coax something haunting and beautiful from the piano. One of the other pianists, a young man from South Korea who'd been practicing Liszt all morning, stopped mid-scale and just listened. He'd never heard anything like it. When Ilara finished the passage, she lowered her hands. The hall was silent. "That was incredible," Clara said gently. Ilara nodded but didn't smile. "I need to rehearse the full piece. Alone, if possible." "Of course," Clara said. "Take all the time you need." For the next 2 days, Ilara lived in that hall. She arrived early in the morning and stayed until the lights were turned off at night. She played her piece over and over, not to perfect it. She already knew it by heart, but to live inside it, to make sure every note carried the truth she'd poured into it. She practiced the flamenco-inspired rhythms, the sudden silences, the way the melody rose like a question and fell like an answer. She worked on the ending, soft, unresolved, like hope that hasn't yet found its shape. She avoided the other finalists. Not out of pride, but because she didn't want distractions. She heard them through the walls, fast scales, thunderous chords, dazzling runs. They were brilliant, no doubt. But their music felt like it was reaching outward, trying to impress. Hers was reaching inward, trying to heal. The night before the final performance, she sat alone in the green room, her mother beside her. They didn't speak much. Her mother just held her hand, her thumb gently stroking the back of Ilara's palm, a small, steady comfort. "You don't have to win," her mother said quietly. "Just be you. That's enough." Ilara nodded, but she knew it wasn't just about winning. It was about being seen, not with eyes but with ears, with hearts. The day of the finals arrived with a nervous energy that buzzed through the entire building. Backstage, the other finalists paced, stretched their fingers, whispered last-minute encouragements to each other. Ilara sat quietly in a corner, her cane across her lap, her breathing slow and even. She wasn't calm, her heart was racing, but she wasn't afraid either. She felt ready. One by one, the finalists were called to the stage. Each performance was met with polite, sometimes enthusiastic applause. A Russian girl played Rachmaninoff with fiery passion. A French boy delivered a flawless Debussy. An American woman stunned the crowd with a modern piece full of dissonance and rhythm. The audience was impressed. The judges took careful notes. Then it was Ilara's turn. Clara came to her side. "They're ready for you," she said softly. "Remember, just play like you did in rehearsal, like no one's listening." Ilara stood. She adjusted her simple black dress, smoothed her hair, and picked up her cane. As she walked toward the stage, she could hear the low murmur of the audience. Hundreds of people, maybe more. She could feel the heat of the stage lights even before she stepped into them. Then the announcer's voice. Next, performing an original composition titled Sonata of the Unseen Sun. Luz, the crowd rustled. Some whispered, "Luz? Never heard of her. Is that a stage name? Where's she from?" And then, seated in the front row of the judges section, Julian Voss leaned toward his neighbor and said, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Another gimmick. Probably can't even see the keys." A few people chuckled. The comment spread like a ripple, but Ilara didn't hear it. Or if she did, she didn't let it in. She stepped onto the stage, her cane tapping lightly on the wooden floor. She walked with quiet confidence to the piano, found the bench by touch, sat down, and placed her cane carefully beside her. For a moment, she just sat there, hands resting on her lap, head slightly bowed. The audience grew still. Even the coughing stopped. Then she lifted her hands and began to play. The first note was so soft, so fragile, it was almost a whisper. It hung in the air like a single drop of water falling into a deep well. Then another, and another. Slow, deliberate, each one carrying a world of feeling. The hall, packed with people, fell into a silence so complete it felt sacred. She played the opening theme, a simple melody that seemed to rise from the dark, searching, yearning. Then came the first silence. Not a pause, but a presence. A space where the heart could speak. The audience leaned forward without realizing it. As the piece unfolded, something remarkable happened. The music began to shift. The gentle melody gave way to a sudden storm of sound, fast, rhythmic, fierce. Her right hand danced across the keys while her left hand pounded deep, resonant chords. And then, in the middle of it all, she lifted her right hand and struck the wooden side of the piano with a sharp, percussive clap. Once, twice, echoing the hand claps of flamenco dancers back home. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one had expected that. It was raw. It was alive. It was human. She wove in fragments of familiar music, not to show off, but to connect. A hint of Chopin's Longing, a shadow of Beethoven's Moonlight, but transformed, reborn through her own experience. And then just when the music threatened to overwhelm, she brought it back to stillness. A single note, a breath. A silence that said more than words ever could. In the front row, Julian Voss sat frozen. His pen had stopped moving. His usual smirk was gone. He stared at the girl on stage, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something new. Awe. He'd expected a trick. A novelty. A blind girl playing pretty tunes. Instead, he was hearing something he hadn't heard in years, maybe ever. Music that wasn't just technically perfect, but emotionally true. Music that didn't explain itself, it revealed itself. And in that revelation, he saw his own arrogance reflected back at him, small and hollow. Backstage, the other finalists stood in the wings, forgotten. They weren't thinking about their own performances anymore. They were listening, really listening for the first time. When Alara reached the final passage, she slowed even more. The notes came like footsteps in snow. Soft, deliberate, vanishing as soon as they landed. The last chord wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, unresolved. Fading into silence like a question left hanging in the air. She lowered her, hands in the hall stayed, silent. Not because they didn't know how to react, but because they were afraid to break the gear. Spelled 10 seconds passed, then 15. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, from the back of the hall, one person stood up, then another, and another, until the entire audience was on their feet, clapping, not politely but passionately, tears streaming down faces, hands red from applause. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, a wave of pure emotion crashing against the stage. Alara didn't stand right away. She kept her hands in her lap, her head bowed, letting the sound wash over her. She didn't need to see them to know what was happening. She could feel it in the air, in the vibration of the floor, in the warmth of the noise, in the way the silence before had been replaced by something alive and grateful. Finally, she rose. She picked up her cane, turned toward the audience and gave a small, humble bow, and in that moment no one saw a blind girl. They saw a musician, a truth-teller, a light in the dark. The applause didn't stop. It rolled through the concert hall like thunder after a long drought, deep, relentless, full of something more than admiration. It was gratitude, relief, a kind of shared awe that left people breathless. Alara stood at the piano, her cane in one hand, the other resting lightly on the polished wood, her head bowed not in shame, but in quiet reverence. She didn't need to see the sea of standing figures to feel what was happening. The sound alone told her everything, the way it swelled, broke, then rose again. The choked sobs from the front rows, the rhythmic stomping of feet joining the clapping. This wasn't just approval. It was recognition. Backstage, the other finalists stood frozen in the wings, their own ambitions momentarily forgotten. One of them wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and whispered, "I've never heard anything like that." Another just shook her head, smiling through tears. They'd come to compete, but what they'd just witnessed wasn't competition, it was communion. In the judges' row, the usual scribbling had stopped. Pens lay still on notepads. One elderly woman, a former concert pianist herself, pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady her heartbeat. Beside her, Julian Voss sat utterly still. His face, usually so composed, so certain, was pale. His hands, which had mocked and measured music for decades, lay open on his lap like empty bowls. He hadn't clapped at first. He couldn't. Something inside him had cracked open and he was too stunned to move. But then slowly he stood. Not because he felt he should. Not out of politeness, but because his body had no other choice. The music had reached into him and pulled something loose. Pride, maybe, or the brittle shell of his certainty. He began to clap softly at first, then harder, his eyes never leaving the stage. When Alara turned to bow, their eyes didn't meet. She couldn't see him. But he felt seen all the same. Exposed. And for the first time in years, he didn't mind. After the ovation finally began to settle, the announcer returned to the microphone, his voice unsteady. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated for the final deliberations." The audience sat, but the air still hummed. People exchanged glances, whispered to their neighbors, dabbed at their eyes. No one talked about technique or tempo. They talked about how the music made them feel. like they'd been given a glimpse into someone else's soul. Alara was led backstage by Clara, who hugged her tightly the moment they were out of sight. "You were magnificent," she said, her voice thick. "Absolutely magnificent." Alara just nodded, her breathing still uneven. She could feel the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a deep, quiet exhaustion and something else. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but from having finally said what she needed to say. Her mother was waiting in the green room, tears streaming down her face. She didn't say a word. She just pulled Alara into her arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which, of course, she was. The judges took longer than usual to decide. Normally, the results came within an hour. This time, it was nearly 2. The tension backstage was thick. The other finalists paced, checked their phones, tried to distract themselves. But Alara sat quietly in a corner, her hands folded, her mind already drifting back to the music, replaying not the performance, but the feeling, the way the silence had held its breath, the way the final note had hung in the air like a promise. Finally, the door opened. The head judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, stepped in. She looked at each finalist in turn, then her gaze settled on Alara. "The jury has reached a unanimous decision," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "The winner of this year's Geneva International Piano Competition is..." Loose, there was no gasp, no surprise, just a slow, collective nod as if everyone had known it all along. The other finalists didn't look disappointed. They looked relieved, as if justice had been done. Alara stood. Her legs felt weak, but she walked steadily back onto the stage, her cane tapping softly against the floor. The audience rose again, not with the same thunder as before, but with a deep, respectful warmth. This time the applause was quieter, more personal, like a thank you. The head judge placed the trophy in Alara's hands. It was cool, heavy, shaped like a coiled treble clef. Then she stepped back and gestured for the winner to say a few words. Alara took a breath. She wasn't used to speaking in front of crowds, but this felt important. "I didn't come here to win," she began, her voice soft but clear, amplified by the hall's acoustics. "I came here because someone once told me I couldn't understand music because I've never seen light. But music isn't about seeing. It's about listening. With your ears, yes, but also with your heart. My grandmother used to say that the deepest truths are often spoken in silence. That's what I tried to share tonight." She paused, then added, "Thank you for listening." She didn't mention Julian Voss by name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew who she meant. And in that moment, the man himself stood up, not to clap, but to walk slowly toward the stage. A hush fell over the audience. Cameras swiveled. People leaned forward. Julian Voss climbed the steps to the stage, his usual swagger gone. He stopped a few feet from Alara, cleared his throat, and then knelt, not in ceremony, but in humility. He picked up the microphone that had been left on the piano bench. "I was wrong," he said, his voice rough, unguarded. "I thought music needed eyes to be understood. But you showed me tonight that it only needs a soul. You don't just play the piano, you speak through it. And what you said? It was more honest than anything I've heard in 20 years. He looked out at the audience, then back at Alara. "I owe you an apology. Not just for what I said in Vienna, but for every time I confused perfection with truth. You've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." Then, to everyone's astonishment, he reached out and gently touched her hand, the hand that had just moved the world. "Thank you," he whispered so softly only she could hear. The audience didn't erupt this time. They sat in stunned silence, then began to clap, not for the drama, but for the humanity of it. For the rare side of a proud man choosing humility, for the blind girl who played not to prove a point, but to share a piece of her heart. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed. Microphones were thrust toward Alara, questions fired from every direction. "Who are you? Where did you learn to play like that? Will you record an album?" She answered simply, politely, but kept her answers short. She wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in truth. Later that night, in the quiet of their hotel room, her mother helped her unpack the trophy. It sat on the small desk, gleaming under the lamplight. "You did it, Mija," her mother said, brushing a strand of hair from Alara's face. "No," Alara said softly. "We did it. You never stopped believing." Her mother smiled. "Your grandmother would be dancing in the kitchen right now." Alara laughed, a real light sound that hadn't been heard in weeks. She sat by the window, listening to the city below. Geneva at night was different from home, quieter, more orderly. But it felt kind tonight, welcoming. The next morning, the world woke up to her performance. Someone had recorded it on a phone from the balcony. The video spread like wildfire. By noon, it had 500,000 views. By evening, it was trending in over 30 countries. Headlines called it the performance that broke the internet. Classical music critics wrote essays. Musicians shared it with captions like, "This changed how I hear everything." A famous conductor tweeted, "If this doesn't move you, check your pulse." But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people. A mother wrote, "My son is blind." He heard this and said, "Maybe I can do something beautiful too." A piano teacher in Brazil said she'd play it for her students to teach them that music isn't about perfection, it's about honesty. A veteran with PTSD messaged a fan page, "I haven't slept through the night in years. Last night I played this on repeat and finally felt calm." Alara didn't read most of it. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift in the air. The way strangers spoke to her now, not with pity or curiosity, but with respect. With wonder, Julian Voss kept his word. A week after the competition, he published a long essay in a major music journal titled, "What I Learned from a Girl Who Sees with Her Hands." In it, he wrote openly about his arrogance, his fear of vulnerability, and how one performance had shattered his illusions. He ended with a simple line, "True art doesn't dazzle the eyes. It awakens the heart." He also did something else. Without telling anyone, he donated his entire fee from his upcoming world tour to a new fund he helped create. One that would support young musicians with disabilities, especially those without access to formal training. He named it the Loose Initiative, though Alara asked him to change it. "Call it the Unseen Sun," she said, "because everyone has light, even if no one sees it." As the weeks passed, offers poured in. Record deals, concert tours, interviews on major networks. But Alara turned most of them down. She agreed to one thing, a small concert back in her village open to anyone who wanted to come. No tickets, no fancy stage. Just her old piano, and the people who'd known her since she was a child. On the day of the concert, the village square was packed. Neighbors brought chairs, blankets, even pots of stew to share. Children sat cross-legged on the ground, wide-eyed. Don Rafael stood in the back, arms crossed, a rare smile on his face. When Alara played Sonata of the Unseen Sun under the open sky, with birds flying overhead and the scent of orange blossoms in the air, it sounded different than it had in Geneva, simpler, truer. Because this time, she wasn't playing for judges or cameras or history, she was playing for home. And as the final note faded into the evening breeze, the only sound was the soft clapping of hands, calloused, familiar, full of love and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most powerful music isn't the kind that shocks the world, it's the kind that heals it. Life didn't change overnight, but it changed all the same. Back in her village, the days still began with the crow of roosters and the smell of bread baking in the old stone oven down the street. Alara still watered the geraniums on the windowsill, still walked the familiar path to the market with her mother, still listened to the wind in the olive trees like it was a lullaby. But something was different now, not in the place, but in the way people saw her. Not as the blind girl who kept to herself, but as the one who had carried their quiet hills into the world and brought something beautiful back. Letters arrived daily. Some were from strangers who'd watched the video from Geneva. Others came from music schools, concert halls, even government offices offering support. But the ones Alara kept in a small wooden box by her bed were the handwritten notes from children. Blind kids, mostly, who wrote things like, "I want to learn piano now," or, "You made me feel like I'm not broken." She read each one slowly, her fingers tracing the raised ink, her heart swelling with a quiet responsibility she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. She turned down the big record deals, not because she didn't appreciate them, but because she knew what mattered. She didn't want to become a product, polished and packaged for mass consumption. She wanted to stay true to the music that had saved her, the kind that came from silence, from struggle, from love. Instead, she worked with a small independent label that let her record on her own terms. The album, simply titled Lose, featured her original compositions alongside reimagined folk songs from her region. each piece recorded in her living room on that old upright piano. When it was released, it didn't top the charts, but it found its people. Teachers played it in classrooms. Therapists used it in sessions. Parents played it to help their anxious children fall asleep. More importantly, she used her platform to build something lasting. With the help of Don Raphael and a few generous donors, including a quiet, consistent contribution from Julian Voss, she founded a scholarship program for young musicians with visual impairments. It wasn't just about paying for lessons or instruments. It was about access, dignity, and belief. The program connected students with teachers trained in adaptive methods, provided audio-based learning tools, and hosted small gatherings where blind and sighted musicians could play together, not as inspiration, but as equals. The first recipient was a 12-year-old boy from a nearby town who'd been told he'd never read music, so he shouldn't bother learning piano. Within a year, he was composing his own pieces, melodies full of rain and thunder and the sound of his dog barking. When he played for Ilara over a crackling phone call, she cried. Not out of pity, but pride. Because she recognized the spark in him, the same one that had once flickered in her, nearly extinguished by a careless word in a grand hall. Julian Voss, for his part, kept his promise. He didn't just write an essay and disappear. He showed up, not with fanfare but with humility. He visited music schools that served students with disabilities. He sat in on lessons, not to correct, but to listen. He even began incorporating more silence into his own performances, pausing longer between phrases, letting the music breathe. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. Some said his playing had softened. He preferred to say it had deepened. 2 years after Geneva, he reached out to Ilara with a simple request. Would you consider performing a duet with me? Not for fame. Not for headlines, just for music. She hesitated. The memory of Vienna still lingered like a scar that had healed but left its mark. But she also remembered the man who'd knelt on that stage, voice trembling, saying he was wrong. That took courage, maybe more than playing a perfect concerto ever could. Yes, she said, but only if we play something new, something we create together. They spent weeks composing over video calls, sending voice memos back and forth, arguing gently over phrasing, laughing when they both reached for the same chord at the same time. The piece they built was unlike anything either had done before, a conversation between two voices, one shaped by sight and precision, the other by darkness and intuition. It had moments of tension, moments of harmony, and long stretches of silence where neither played, trusting the other to know when to begin again. And they chose the venue carefully, the same concert hall in Vienna where it had all begun. The night of the performance, the hall was sold out. Not just with critics and elites, but with families, students, people who'd followed Ilara's journey from the beginning. Julian Voss arrived early, pacing backstage like a nervous student. When Ilara walked in, guided by her mother, he stopped and simply said, "You look ready?" "So do you," she replied. They didn't rehearse on stage. They didn't need to. They'd already found their rhythm in the quiet spaces between their differences. When they walked out together, him in his tailored suit, her in a simple dress, her white cane tapping lightly against the floor, the audience rose not in anticipation but in respect. There were no whispers this time, no smirks, just a deep collective breath as if the whole room was preparing to listen with more than their ears. They sat at the grand piano side by side. He played the left hand, she played the right. At first their styles clashed, his precise, hers fluid, but soon they found a middle ground, a shared language. The music unfolded like a story. Two people, once divided by pride and prejudice, now weaving something whole from their broken pieces. Midway through, Ilara introduced a rhythm, soft palm strikes on the piano's wood, just like in her solo piece. Without missing a beat, Julian joined her, tapping the frame in time. The sound was unexpected, human, alive. The audience leaned forward, smiling. When the final notes faded, neither moved right away. They just sat, hands resting on the keys, breathing together in the silence they'd once misunderstood. Then slowly, the applause began, not thunderous, but warm, steady, full of understanding. People didn't just clap for the music. They clapped for the journey, for the apology that became action, for the girl who turned ridicule into revelation. Afterward, they stood and bowed, not as teacher and student, not as famous and unknown, but as partners, as friends. In the years that followed, Alara never stopped playing. She performed in small towns and big cities, always choosing venues that were accessible, always making time for young musicians who reached out to her. She never called herself an inspiration. "I'm just a person who loves music," she'd say. That's all. But to those who listened, she was more. She was proof that limitations don't define you. Your response to them does. That silence isn't empty, it's full of possibility. That being seen isn't about eyes, but about being heard. Her mother still sat in the front row at every concert, always with a tissue in her pocket. Don Rafael, now in his 80s, rarely missed a performance, though he'd grumble about the travel. And Julian Voss? He became a regular visitor to the village, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. He'd sit in Alara's living room sipping tea, listening to her new compositions, sometimes offering a suggestion, more often just sitting in grateful silence. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in colors Alara would never see but always felt in the cooling air, they sat together on the porch. "You know," Julian said quietly, "I used to think music was about control, about mastering every note, every breath, every moment, but you taught me it's about surrender, about letting the music move through you, not just from you." Alara smiled. "My grandmother used to say the best songs are the ones you don't plan. They find you when you're quiet enough to listen." He nodded. "I'm learning to be quiet." They sat in comfortable silence then, listening to the crickets begin their nightly song, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. No grand declarations, no dramatic endings. Just two people, once strangers, now bound by something deeper than sight or sound. Back in the concert hall in Vienna, a plaque was quietly installed near the entrance. It didn't mention fame or awards. It simply read, "Music lives not in the eyes, but in the spaces between the notes and in the hearts willing to listen." And every now and then, a young musician would pause before stepping inside, touch the words with their fingers, take a deep breath, and walk in, not to prove they belonged, but to share the truth only they could tell. Because Alara's story wasn't really about shocking the world. It was about reminding it of something it had forgotten, that beauty doesn't need to be seen to be real. That courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes plays a single note in the dark and waits for the world to catch up. And in the end, that was enough. There was no grand finale, no final curtain call, because real life doesn't end like a story. It keeps going quietly, steadily, like a river finding its way to the sea. For Alara, the years after that duet in Vienna weren't filled with headlines or red carpets. They were filled with mornings spent teaching a nervous teenager how to feel the rhythm in their chest instead of counting beats. With afternoons listening to recordings sent by students from places she'd never been. Japan, Kenya, Brazil, each one carrying a piece of their world in the spaces between the notes. She didn't keep trophies on display. She kept letters. And in those letters she found her purpose. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a stack of mail, she came across an envelope with no return address, just a postmark from a small town near the Alps. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but clear. "I heard your piece Unseen Son on the radio while driving home from the hospital. My daughter was born blind last week. I was scared, but your music made me believe she'll be okay. Thank you for giving me hope." Alara read it 3 times, her fingers tracing each word like braille. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box on her desk, the one that held all the notes that mattered. She didn't reply with a public message or a polished quote. She wrote a simple letter back. "Your daughter already is okay. She just hasn't met her song yet. When she does, it'll be beautiful." That became her quiet mission, not to be famous, but to be present. She started hosting free monthly workshops in the village square, open to anyone who wanted to learn regardless of age, ability, or background. Sighted children sat beside blind elders. Teenagers with anxiety played alongside retired teachers. No one was judged for wrong notes. "Mistakes are just music trying to find its way," she'd say, smiling. And slowly the village became known not for its olives or its old church, but for its sound, the gentle hum of shared creativity, the laughter between scales, the clatter of teacups during breaks. Don Rafael, now in his late 80s, still came to every session, though he walked with a cane of his own and often fell asleep in the back chair. But if someone played something true, his eyes would snap open and he'd nod once, his highest praise. He never called Alara a prodigy. He called her a keeper of the flame, and she knew what he meant. Not the kind of flame that dazzles, but the kind that warms, that stays lit through long winters. Julian Voss visited less often as the years passed, but when he did, it was never for show. He'd arrive unannounced, carrying a bag of pastries from the city, and sit on the porch with Alara and her mother, talking about music, life, the way the light changed over the hills at dusk, things he now described in detail, as if making up for all the beauty he'd once taken for granted. He never played in the workshops, but sometimes late at night, he'd sit at the old piano and play softly just for her. And she'd sit beside him, listening not to the notes but to the man behind them. Less certain now, more tender, finally free of the need to be perfect. One spring, a documentary crew reached out. They wanted to make a film about her journey, not as a miracle but as a quiet revolution in how the world sees ability, art, and belonging. She agreed, but only on one condition. The film wouldn't focus on her blindness. It would focus on listening, on community, on the idea that everyone has a song, even if they haven't found the courage to sing it yet. The crew stayed for weeks. They filmed children tapping rhythms on tabletops, elders humming folk tunes, Alara guiding a young boy's hands over the keys as he played his first melody. They captured the way the village gathered after rain to play music under the covered market, how neighbors brought instruments they hadn't touched in decades just to join in. The film didn't have a dramatic climax. It ended with a wide shot of the square at sunset, voices and instruments blending into something warm and whole, and Alara's voiceover. Music isn't something you own. It's something you pass on, like kindness, like hope. When it aired, it didn't go viral, but it found its way into schools, community centers, therapy offices. Teachers used it to start conversations about difference and dignity. Parents showed it to their kids and said, "See? Everyone belongs." And then, one ordinary Tuesday, a letter arrived that changed everything, not for Alara, but for someone else. It was from a music conservatory in Paris. Not an offer for her, but a request. They'd seen the documentary. They'd read about her scholarship program. And they wanted to partner with her to create the first fully accessible piano curriculum in Europe, designed by blind musicians, for blind musicians, but open to all. It would include tactile notation, audio-guided lessons, and mentorship from artists like her. They asked if she'd help lead it. She didn't say yes right away. She thought about the village, her students, the quiet rhythm of her days. But then she remembered the girl she'd once been, the one who sat in a grand hall, heart-pounding, hoping someone would hear her beyond her blindness. If this could spare even one child that pain, it was worth the risk. So she said yes, not by leaving home but by building a bridge. She traveled to Paris once a month, working with educators, testing new methods, listening to students describe what worked and what didn't. She insisted that sighted students learn alongside blind ones, not as helpers, but as peers. Music is a conversation, she told them, and conversations need two voices. Back home, the village adapted. Her mother and Don Raphael took over the weekly workshops. A young woman who'd been one of Alara's first students now led the children's group. The music didn't stop, it grew. Years turned into decades. Alara's hair grayed. Her hands, once quick and sure, sometimes ached in the cold. But she still played, not for crowds mostly, but for joy, for connection, for the sheer love of sound meeting silence and making something new. And then, on a crisp autumn morning, she received an invitation she never expected. The Vienna Concert Hall, the same one where it all began, was celebrating its 150th anniversary. They wanted to open the gala with a performance of Sonata of the Unseen Sun. Not by her, by a new generation, a blind pianist from Argentina, trained through the very program Alara had helped build, would play it. And they asked if Alara would come, not to perform, just to be there. To witness, she went, not with fanfare but with her mother, now in her 80s, leaning on a cane of her own. They sat in the same front row where Alara had once been mocked. The hall looked the same, gilded, grand, echoing with history, but the air felt different. Lighter, kinder. When the young pianist walked on stage, her white cane tapping softly, The audience didn't whisper. They held their breath. And when she began to play, her interpretation bold, fresh, full of her own fire, Ilara closed her eyes and listened. Not to compare, not to judge, but to receive. In that moment, she didn't hear her own pain. She heard her legacy, not in fame or awards, but in the courage of another young person stepping into the light they couldn't see, trusting that the world would listen. After the performance, the young pianist bowed, then walked straight to Ilara's seat. She knelt, not in worship, but in gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because of you, I never had to ask if I belonged. I just knew." Ilara reached out and took her hand. "No," she said gently. "You belong because you're here, because you play, because you're brave. I just helped clear the path." Later that night, as they walked back to their hotel under a sky full of stars neither of them could see, her mother squeezed her arm. "You did good, Misha," she said. Ilara smiled. "We did good, and that was the truth." It was never just her. It was the grandmother who sang in the kitchen, the mother who believed when no one else did, the old teacher who saw her soul, not her eyes, the rival who chose humility over pride, the strangers who sent letters, the students who kept the music alive. Her story wasn't about shocking the world. It was about stitching it back together, one note, one act of kindness, one moment of listening at a time. Now in her village, there's a small music school with wide doorways, braille sheet music and pianos tuned to perfection. Children come from all over the region to learn. Some are blind, some aren't. They all sit together. They all play. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you walk past the open windows, you'll hear a familiar melody, soft, searching, full of silence, and know that the light is still there. Not in the eyes, but in the music.